She called it forbidden. I called it fate. And in that moment, I knew some rules were never meant to be followed. I never thought an evening class would change the rhythm of my life. At 24, I wasn't the youngest in the room, but I wasn't the oldest either. I came here to sharpen my mind, to feel productive again after drifting through months of uncertainty. What I didn't expect was the presence of her. She walked into the classroom on the very first day with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She must have been in her early 40s, though age clung to her like grace rather than weight. Her steps were measured, her gaze steady, and when she began to speak, the room fell into an effortless silence. It wasn't just knowledge in her tone, it was the warmth of experience, the kind that made you want to lean in closer, to catch every word. I sat at the back at first, thinking I would blend in, but somehow I found myself watching her more closely than the whiteboard. The way her hair shifted under the fluorescent light, the soft curve of her smile when a student finally understood a point, the faint lines around her eyes that only deepened when she laughed, details I shouldn't have been noticing, but couldn't ignore. When she passed by my desk that first week, leaning over slightly to glance at my notes, I caught the faintest trace of her perfume, something subtle, floral, not overpowering. It lingered long after she moved on, distracting me from everything she had just explained. For a second, my pen froze, and I felt almost foolish, like a boy caught staring. But what surprised me more was the way she looked back at me once, during a question I asked. Her eyes lingered just a moment longer than they needed to, as if curiosity had brushed past her guard. Maybe it was nothing, maybe I imagined it, but that moment etched itself into me like a spark catching on dry wood. From then on, the classroom felt different. It wasn't just a place of study, it was a space where silence carried weight, where every brush of proximity seemed louder than words. She was my teacher, I was her student, and between us stretched a line that neither of us had dared to touch. But still, I felt it, like electricity in the air before a storm. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew that something had begun, quietly, invisibly, in the pauses between her words and the spaces between her steps. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I wouldn't forget the way my heart stirred every time she spoke. The weeks slipped by in a quiet rhythm, but something between us kept shifting. At first, it was subtle, small fragments of connection hidden beneath the surface of ordinary lessons. She was still my teacher, still the figure at the front of the class with her composed posture and steady voice, but I began to notice how often our paths crossed in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like gravity. Sometimes it was her leaning over my desk to explain a concept, her hand brushing against the edge of my notebook as her sleeve grazed my arm. The slightest contact sent a warmth through me, too small to be seen, too strong to ignore. Other times, it was the way her eyes found mine across the classroom when I asked a question, an unspoken acknowledgement, like she was answering something more than what I had spoken aloud. I started lingering after class. At first, it was innocent, I'd ask about an assignment, about a book she mentioned, about details that hardly needed clarification. But those conversations always stretched, turning from lectures into stories. She told me once about her favorite author, her voice softening with a fondness that made her seem less like a teacher and more like a woman, one with her own passions, her own private joys. I told her about my restlessness, how I had drifted between jobs, how I wanted something steady but hadn't yet found it. She listened with patience, her eyes gentle, like she saw more of me than I meant to reveal. And then there were the little things. The way her smile slipped in unexpectedly when I made a dry comment. The way her fingers tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, as if unaware of how endearing the gesture looked. The way silence between us never felt awkward, it felt charged, as if silence itself carried meaning. She never crossed the line. She always kept her words careful, her tone measured. But the air between us said what neither of us dared to voice. Each glance, each pause, each unnecessary explanation was another thread pulling us closer, weaving a fabric of quiet tension that no one else could see. I told myself it was nothing. Just admiration for someone wiser, someone graceful. But when I left the classroom each night, her voice lingered in my mind, the warmth of her presence following me into dreams. And deep down, I began to wonder if she felt the same pull, if her glances lingered because she, too, was fighting something she couldn't name. It was a Thursday evening when I saw her differently. The classroom was emptier than usual, half the students had skipped because of the heavy rain outside. By the end of the lesson, thunder echoed faintly in the distance, and most people left quickly, rushing home to beat the storm. But she stayed behind, sitting alone at her desk. Her papers were spread out before her, yet untouched. Her pen rested motionless in her hand. There was a look in her eyes that didn't belong to a teacher, it belonged to someone lost in thought, someone carrying more than she cared to admit. For a moment, I simply watched from the back, caught between leaving and intruding. But something in me refused to walk away. I stepped closer, and my voice came softer than I intended. "Are you all right?" She blinked, almost startled, as though she had forgotten I was still there. Then she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that tries to hide more than it reveals. "Just tired," she said, but her tone betrayed her. It wasn't the weariness of a long day, it was the quiet confession of a long life lived in silence. I sat at the desk beside her, not pushing, just being there. She sighed, setting the pen down. And then, as though the words had been waiting at the edge of her lips for too long, she admitted softly, "Teaching fills my days, but sometimes it feels so lonely. People forget that I, exist outside these walls." There was no lecture in her tone, no distance of authority, only a woman speaking her truth. For the first time, she wasn't my teacher. She was simply herself. Vulnerable. Human. I wanted to tell her she wasn't invisible, that I saw her in ways she couldn't imagine. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I offered presence, a kind of listening that spoke louder than any reply. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine, as if measuring whether she had revealed too much. When she reached for a paper, our hands brushed. It should have been nothing, just an accident. But neither of us moved right away. The warmth of her skin pressed lightly against mine, and in that fragile pause, something unsaid passed between us. Her breath caught almost imperceptibly before she pulled away. Her voice was barely a whisper. "This is against the rules." But I could hear the conflict beneath her words, the struggle between duty and desire. And in that moment, the rules felt smaller than the truth in her eyes. The rain came harder that night, lashing against the classroom windows like a warning. By the time we finished, it was pouring too heavily to leave. A few students waited under the awning outside, but one by one, they braved the storm and disappeared into the blur of streetlights and water. Soon, it was just her and me, the building nearly silent except for the steady drum of rain on the roof. She suggested we waited out in the faculty lounge, where at least the coffee machine hummed and the lights felt warmer. I followed her through the echo of empty halls, my footsteps unconsciously matching hers. The air between us carried a weight, not uncomfortable, but undeniable. Inside the lounge, she poured 2 cups of coffee, her fingers brushing the rim of one before sliding it across the table toward me. She sat opposite, her posture composed but her eyes softer than usual. We talked at first about harmless things, books, the weather, how the rain reminded her of her childhood. I listened closely, clinging to every piece of her that she was willing to share. But laughter found us unexpectedly. A clumsy joke I made slipped past my nerves, and she laughed, not the polite chuckle of a teacher humoring a student, but a real laugh, full and unguarded. The sound startled me with how rare and beautiful it was. For a moment, the storm outside faded, replaced by the warmth inside that room. When the laughter died, silence stretched. She looked at me differently, as if realizing just how close we had drifted. Her fingers toyed with the handle of her mug, her expression caught between hesitation and something else. And then, almost too quickly, she set the cup down and shook her head. "You know this can't happen," she whispered, her voice firm but trembling underneath. I leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze. I didn't argue, didn't push. I only smiled faintly and said, just above the hush of the rain, rules were made to be broken. Her eyes widened, not with anger, but with shock, and something deeper, something she didn't dare name. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she looked away, pressing her palm to her temple as though steadying herself. The storm outside roared, but inside the room, it was quieter than ever. She didn't answer me. She didn't have to. The way her chest rose and fell, the flush on her cheeks, the silence she clung to, all of it told me she was no longer certain of the rules she once guarded so carefully. Something had cracked, and we both knew it. After that night in the lounge, nothing between us looked the same. On the surface, she remained the same woman, structured, composed, careful with her words in front of the class. But I had learned to listen between the lines. The weight of silence, the flicker in her eyes, the way she avoided holding my gaze too long, they all told me more than words ever could. In class, our connection became a language of its own. When she leaned over my desk to point out a correction, her hand hovered just close enough that I felt the heat of it against my skin. When she passed me a stack of papers, her fingers brushed mine for a fraction of a second too long. None of these moments could be called deliberate, yet none of them felt accidental either. It wasn't only the touches. It was the way her voice softened when she answered my questions, lowering just enough that it felt meant only for me. It was how her smile lingered when I said something that amused her, a smile quickly masked by professionalism but never fast enough to erase the trace it left behind. The others in class noticed nothing. To them, she was still the untouchable figure at the front of the room. But to me, every glance, every pause, every subtle shift carried meaning. It was as if the walls between us were thinning, letting light pass through without breaking entirely. One evening, while she was erasing the board, I stepped up to hand her a marker she had dropped. Our hands touched, deliberately this time. Her eyes lifted to mine, wide, uncertain. But she didn't pull away. For the briefest heartbeat, her hand remained under mine, warm and trembling. Then, as though reminding herself of who she was supposed to be, she withdrew. But the hesitation came too late, the agreement had already been made. We never spoke of it. She never acknowledged the line we had already crossed. Yet from then on, the air was different, heavier, charged, almost alive. She stopped resisting the closeness. She let the silence between us stretch. She let the warmth of my presence linger beside her without protest. It was dangerous, yes. It was unspoken, fragile, hidden beneath layers of caution. But it was also undeniable. The rules she once clung to so tightly had begun to loosen, and though her lips never said it, her heart had already whispered the truth, she no longer wanted distance. And neither did I. It was late, the kind of evening when the world outside feels hushed, and the fluorescent lights above buzz quietly like they're guarding secrets. Once again, I stayed after class, though this time, I didn't pretend to have questions. She knew it, and I knew it. Yet she didn't ask me to leave. Instead, she sat at her desk, tidying papers she'd already organized twice, her movements slower than usual, as if keeping busy might protect her from what lingered between us. I stood nearby, waiting, giving her space to speak if she wanted to. Finally, she set her pen down and exhaled, her shoulders sinking with the weight of a confession. "Do you have any idea what this would cost me?" she asked softly, not looking at me. Her voice carried a tremor, a rare crack in the shield she always wore. I didn't answer right away. I could feel the fragility in her words, the fear wrapped around them like glass that might shatter if touched too roughly. So I spoke carefully, letting my tone steady hers. "I know it's not simple. But feelings don't always ask for permission, do they?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes still fixed on the papers before her. "If anyone found out, my career, my reputation, it would all be over. People wouldn't understand. They'd see me as reckless, irresponsible." She trailed off, finally meeting my gaze, her eyes shimmering under the harsh light. And maybe they'd be right. The vulnerability in her expression pierced me. For the first time, I saw not the teacher, not the composed woman at the front of the classroom, but a soul carrying years of loneliness, fear, and self-restraint. She wasn't worried about rules alone, she was terrified of being seen as unworthy. I moved closer, not rushing, just enough that the space between us felt intimate. My hand rested lightly on the desk near hers, not touching yet, just offering steadiness. "You're not reckless," I said gently. "You're human. And maybe you've spent too long hiding that." Her breath caught, her fingers trembling as they brushed against mine, hesitant, searching. This time, I didn't pull away. The warmth of her hand slipped under mine, fragile but deliberate, as though she needed the reassurance that she wasn't stepping into this alone. For a long moment, we stayed like that, her fears spilling into silence, my presence answering them without words. Tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back. She didn't move her hand away. In that fragile closeness, I knew something had shifted. The rules had already been broken, but now the walls around her heart were breaking too. And for the first time, she allowed herself to be held, not by arms, but by trust. The night finally came when neither of us pretended anymore. The lesson had ended, the classroom emptied, and she remained behind as always, carefully gathering her papers, carefully avoiding my gaze. But there was something different in the air that evening, less hesitation, less fight. As if she had finally grown weary of carrying the weight of resistance. I lingered by the door, waiting, giving her the space to decide. She looked up, her eyes finding mine, and for once, she didn't look away. She held that gaze, steady and unflinching, and in it I read everything she had left unsaid for weeks. Without a word, I walked closer. She didn't retreat, didn't raise the wall of rules between us. Instead, her breath caught lightly, her hands pausing mid-movement as if acknowledging that the choice was already made. "You know what this means," she whispered, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. I nodded. "I know. And I don't care." She exhaled, a shaky breath that carried both fear and relief. Then, in a gesture so small yet so monumental, she reached for her bag, closed it, and set it aside. That simple act felt like closing a door on every excuse she had clung to. When I offered my hand, she looked at it for a long moment, her hesitation trembling in her fingers. But slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in mine. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rushed. It was quiet. Honest. The warmth of her skin against mine was the answer I had been waiting for. We walked out of the building together, side by side. The rain from earlier weeks had given way to a calm, star-strewn sky, the kind of night that made the world feel wide yet intimate. Our steps matched without effort, the silence between us no longer heavy with denial, but lightened with acceptance. At the edge of the parking lot, she paused, turning to face me. Her smile was faint, uncertain, but it carried something new, freedom. "I don't know where this leads," she admitted. I squeezed her hand gently. "Then let's find out. Together." For a moment, she simply looked at me, her eyes softening, her guard dissolving piece by piece. And then she let out the smallest laugh, a laugh that sounded like surrender and hope all at once. She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. Her hand stayed in mine, her smile lingering in the night air, and that was enough. The rules were broken. The world hadn't ended. Instead, it had begun, quietly, warmly, with two hearts choosing each other against every reason not to. And in that moment, it felt like the most natural choice in the world.